What happens when you rescue a stray kitten? But 3 months later, it weighs 15 pounds, has spots, and growls at the UPS driver. The crew at Henderson's Lumber thought they were just doing a good deed. But when their kitten started sprouting ear tufts and hunting like a pro, they realized they'd made a huge mistake. He didn't meow, he screamed. And by the time the warehouse crew finally figured out what they'd been hand-feeding Tuna to, it was too late to turn back. They hadn't rescued a house cat at all. They'd accidentally raised a bobcat. This is the story of how a lumber yard unknowingly adopted a predator, and the impossible choice they faced when the authorities found out. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The July sun rose bright and blazing over Henderson's Lumber and Supply in Prescott, Arizona, painting the sprawling warehouse complex in shades of gold and amber. The sky was the kind of blue that made you believe nothing bad could ever happen. Cloudless, infinite, and so cheerful it practically hummed. Hummingbirds darted between the desert willows that lined the gravel parking lot, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was doing its level best to imitate a car alarm. Bobby Ray Henderson, 63 years old and built like a retired offensive lineman who discovered biscuits and gravy, pulled his Ford F-250 into its usual spot at 6:15 in the morning. He'd owned Henderson's Lumber for going on 31 years, ever since his father, Bobby Ray Henderson Sr., had handed him the keys and said, "Don't burn it down." So far, he hadn't, though the rodent problem had come close to doing the job for him. "Morning, boss," called out Darlene Foster from the loading dock. Darlene was 58, had arms like a competitive arm wrestler, and had been working the warehouse floor since before most of the younger employees were born. She wore her signature orange safety vest like it was a medal of honor, which, in a way, it was. 22 years without a workplace injury. She had a plaque and everything. "Morning, Darlene," Bobby Ray grunted, adjusting his cap. "Rats get into the insulation again?" "3 pallets," Darlene said grimly. "Chewed right through the plastic wrap. That's the 4th time this month." Bobby Ray let out a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere around his boots. The rodent situation at Henderson's Lumber had gone from nuisance to full-blown crisis over the past year. They'd tried traps. The rats learned to avoid them. They'd tried poison, but the health inspector had opinions about that, none of them favorable. They'd hired an exterminator named Phil who wore a jumpsuit covered in cartoon rats giving thumbs up. And Phil had declared the infestation the worst he'd ever seen outside of a subway system. That wasn't the kind of endorsement Bobby Ray was looking for. "We need a miracle," Bobby Ray muttered, walking through the massive warehouse doors into the cathedral-like interior where stacks of lumber rose like wooden skyscrapers, and pallets of hardware and building supplies formed a labyrinth that would have confused a GPS system. He didn't know it yet, but the miracle was already there, hiding behind a stack of 2x4s, no bigger than a man's boot, shivering in the shadows with eyes the color of new pennies. It was Tommy Sullivan who found it. Tommy was 24, the youngest member of the warehouse crew, and possessed what Darlene generously described as more heart than sense. He'd once tried to rescue a cactus he thought looked sad, and another time he'd called in late because he was helping a family of quail cross a highway. Hey, come look at this!" Tommy's voice echoed through the warehouse around 9 that morning, carrying the unmistakable pitch of someone who had found something small and alive. Darlene and Bobby Ray exchanged a look. The last time Tommy had used that voice, he'd found a nest of baby scorpions in a toolbox and tried to relocate them humanely. Bobby Ray still had the sting mark on his thumb, They found Tommy crouched behind a wall of stacked crates in the back corner of aisle 7, the part of the warehouse everyone called the Badlands, because even the forklift drivers avoided it. He was on his hands and knees, peering under a pallet with his phone flashlight. "What is it this time?" Bobby Ray asked, bracing himself. "It's a kitten," Tommy whispered, his eyes wide and shining. "A tiny little kitten, and I think it's hurt." Bobby Ray crouched down, a process that involved several alarming sounds from his knees, and squinted into the gap. Sure enough, there it was. A small, trembling ball of tawny fur, no more than 4 or 5 weeks old, with oversized ears, a stubby little tail, and the most pitiful expression any of them had ever seen on a living creature. It was thin, too thin. Its ribs were visible beneath its patchy fur, and one of its front paws was held gingerly off the ground, swollen and tender. "Oh, Lord," Darlene said softly, dropping to one knee beside Tommy. The woman who could hoist a 100-pound bag of concrete without breaking a sweat suddenly looked like she might cry. "Poor little thing. It's starving." "Must have crawled in through the loading dock," Bobby Ray said. "Or maybe a stray had her litter somewhere nearby and this one got separated." "We can't just leave it," Tommy said, in the tone of a man who had already made up his mind and was merely informing the universe of his decision. Bobby Ray rubbed the back of his neck. He was a practical man. He ran a warehouse. He had rodent problems, inventory deadlines, and a wife who'd told him that morning that the dishwasher was making a sound like a cat being strangled, which now seemed like an unfortunate choice of words. But then the kitten looked up at him. It had those enormous round eyes, copper gold, flecked with something wild, and it let out a sound. Not a meow exactly, more of a tiny, raspy chirp, like a rusty hinge on a very small door. It was the most heart-wrenching sound Bobby Ray Henderson had ever heard, and he had once sat through his daughter's entire 6th-grade recorder recital. "Fine," he said. "Get it some water, and see if anybody's got cat food in their truck." As it turned out, 3 different people had cat food in their trucks, because this was Arizona, and everybody had a story about a stray something or other. Within 20 minutes, the kitten had been gently coaxed out from under the pallet with small pieces of tuna, had its injured paw wrapped in gauze by Darlene, who had, it emerged, completed a wildlife first aid course just for fun, and was sitting in a cardboard box lined with an old flannel shirt, eating like it hadn't seen food in days. Which, they would later learn, it probably hadn't. "What should we name it?" Tommy asked, stroking the kitten's head with one finger. The little creature purred, a surprisingly loud, rumbling purr for something so small. "Don't name it," Bobby Ray said firmly. "We're not keeping it. We'll call animal control tomorrow." "We could call it Sawdust," Tommy said, completely ignoring him. "Or Lumberjack," offered Hank Morrison, the forklift operator, a burly man of 50 with a handlebar mustache and a secret passion for romance novels. "Get it? Like a lumberjack, but also a cat named Jack?" "That's terrible," Darlene said. "What about Whiskers?" "Whiskers?" Hank looked offended. "That's the most generic cat name in the history of cats." "We're not naming it," Bobby Ray repeated, louder this time. They named it Bandit, because of the dark markings around its eyes that made it look like a tiny, furry outlaw. And because Tommy had already started calling it that, and the name stuck like sawdust on a sweaty arm. Bandit settled into warehouse life with a comfort and confidence that suggested it had read the employee handbook and decided the rules didn't apply to it. Within a week, the kitten had claimed a spot on top of the break room microwave as its personal throne, from which it surveyed the comings and goings of the staff with an expression of benign authority. Within 2 weeks, the rat problem began to improve. Not dramatically. Bandit was still small after all, but the crew noticed fewer droppings near the insulation pallets, and one morning Tommy found a dead mouse laid ceremoniously on the doormat outside the office, like a tiny, gruesome gift. "That's natural hunting instinct," Darlene said approvingly. "Good kitty." By the 1-month mark, several things had become apparent. First, Bandit was not a normal kitten. It was growing fast, much faster than any house cat had a right to. Second, it had an unusual fondness for climbing, not just onto counters and shelves, but up the actual warehouse, racking, scaling 20-foot-tall steel shelving units with the casual ease of a mountain goat in a hardware store. Third, its ears were getting bigger. Not just proportionally bigger, the way a kitten's ears grow with its head, but disproportionately bigger, tufted at the tips with little black points that stood up like exclamation marks. "Does that cat look bigger to anyone else?" Hank asked one afternoon, watching Bandit stroll down aisle 3 with a swagger that could only be described as proprietary. "Cats grow," Bobby Ray said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Not like that, they don't," Hank muttered. By month 3, Bandit weighed roughly 15 pounds, about twice what a domestic cat of its age should have weighed, and had developed spots. Not the faint tabby markings of a house cat, but actual spots. Bold, dark rosettes scattered across its increasingly muscular body like someone had flicked a paintbrush at it. Also, it had started making sounds that no house cat had ever made. A deep, resonant chittering noise when it spotted birds through the warehouse windows. A low, rumbling growl, almost subsonic, when strangers entered the building. And once, when the UPS driver startled it, a scream. Not a hiss. Not a yowl. A full-throated, blood-curdling scream that made the UPS driver drop his scanner and back slowly toward his truck while making the sign of the cross. "I think," Darlene said carefully one morning, holding up her phone with a wildlife identification page loaded on the screen, "that Bandit might not be a house cat." They all gathered around her phone. The page showed a series of photographs of North American wildcats, and there, right there, third picture from the left, was an animal that looked exactly like Bandit. The same tufted ears, the same spotted coat, the same stubby tail, the same look of absolute, unwavering confidence that said, "I am in charge here, and we both know it." Lynx rufus, the North American bobcat. The warehouse went very quiet. "So," Tommy said slowly, "we've been feeding salmon treats to a bobcat." "I gave it belly rubs," Hank whispered, looking at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. "Last Tuesday, it rolled over and I rubbed its belly." "You rubbed a bobcat's belly?" Bobby Ray stared at him. "It seemed like it wanted me to." "Oh, for the love of—" Bobby Ray took off his cap, ran his hand over his head and put the cap back on. This was his thinking gesture. His employees had seen it approximately 4,000 times. "All right, nobody panic. We'll call Fish and Wildlife. They'll come get it, relocate it, and that'll be that." But even as he said it, something heavy settled in his chest. He looked over at Bandit, who was sitting on a stack of plywood, grooming one massive paw with the delicate precision of a surgeon, completely at ease, completely at home. The late afternoon light slanted through the high warehouse windows and caught the cat's fur, turning it to burnished gold. Its copper eyes were half closed, content. Bobby Ray thought about the morning they'd found that trembling, starving little creature behind the crates, and the heavy thing in his chest got heavier. Bobby Ray did call Arizona Fish and Wildlife. He spoke with a field officer named Margaret Caldwell, a woman whose voice carried the patient, slightly weary tone of someone who had heard every possible variation of, "I accidentally adopted a wild animal." "A bobcat," Margaret repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "In your warehouse?" "Yes, ma'am." "For 3 months." "We thought it was a kitten," Bobby Ray protested. Margaret made a sound that might have been a sigh or might have been a suppressed laugh. "Mr. Henderson, I'll be honest with you. We get these calls more often than you'd think. Usually with raccoons, but bobcats aren't unheard of. Here's the situation. If the animal has been in captivity for this long, especially from such a young age, there's a real question about whether it can be successfully reintroduced to the wild." Bobby Ray's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means that if the cat has become habituated to humans, if it associates people with food and safety, releasing it into the wild could be a death sentence. It wouldn't have the survival skills. It might approach humans who aren't as friendly as your crew." "So, what are the options?" There was a pause. "We can assess the animal. If it's too habituated, we'd look at placing it with a licensed wildlife sanctuary. If no placement is available..." She trailed off. Bobby Ray didn't need her to finish that sentence. The silence said everything. The heavy thing in his chest became a stone. "What if," Bobby Ray said slowly, gripping the phone tighter, "what if there was a way for it to stay, not as a pet? I know you can't keep a bobcat as a pet. But what if the warehouse could become some kind of, I don't know, licensed habitat? The cat comes and goes as it pleases. It hunts. It lives naturally. We just provide a safe space." Another pause. Longer this time. "That's unconventional, Mr. Henderson." "I'm an unconventional man, Ms. Caldwell. I can see that." He could hear the smile in her voice now. "Let me talk to my supervisor, and I'm going to send a wildlife veterinarian out to assess the animal. Don't get your hopes up." Bobby Ray hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time. Then he looked out the office window at the warehouse floor, where Bandit was doing what Bandit did best. Walking down the center of aisle 5 like a sheriff patrolling Main Street, its bobbed tail held high, its tufted ears swiveling like satellite dishes, every line of its powerful body radiating the supreme confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it belonged. "Don't worry, kid," Bobby Ray said quietly. "We'll figure this out." Dr. Rebecca Patterson arrived 3 days later in a dusty Jeep Wrangler covered in bumper stickers that said things like, "I break for raptors," and "Wildlife vets do it in the field." She was 45, wiry, sunburned, and had the kind of calm, competent energy that made you trust her immediately, even when she was pulling on elbow-length leather gloves and assembling a catch pole. "Relax," she told the assembled warehouse crew, all of whom were watching from a safe distance with expressions ranging from nervous to terrified. "I've handled bobcats before. They're usually more scared of us than..." Bandit strolled out from behind a stack of drywall, looked at Dr. Patterson, and walked directly up to her. It sniffed her gloved hand. Then it rubbed the side of its face against her knee, leaving a streak of fur on her cargo pants, and sat down at her feet with a chirp. Dr. Patterson stared down at the bobcat. The bobcat stared up at Dr. Patterson. "Well," she said, "that's a first." The examination that followed was unlike anything Dr. Patterson had experienced in 18 years of wildlife veterinary medicine. Bandit submitted to being weighed, 21 pounds and still growing, having its temperature taken with only moderate protest, having its teeth and gums inspected. It yawned helpfully, and having its injured paw, now fully healed, palpated and flexed. "This is the most socialized bobcat I have ever encountered," Dr. Patterson said, scratching behind Bandit's tufted ears while the cat's eyes closed to slits of pure contentment. "It's remarkable. It's not tame. I want to be clear about that. This is still a wild animal with wild instincts, but it's clearly chosen to associate with humans on its own terms." "It chose us," Tommy said proudly. "In a manner of speaking, yes." Dr. Patterson stood up, peeling off her gloves. "Here's what I think happened. This bobcat was likely orphaned very young. Possibly its mother was killed by a vehicle or a predator. It found its way into your warehouse at a critical developmental stage, and your crew became its social group. But it's also clearly maintaining its wild behaviors. It hunts, it patrols territory, it comes and goes freely." "So can it stay?" Bobby Ray asked, trying to keep the hope out of his voice and failing entirely. Dr. Patterson looked at him. Then she looked at Bandit, who had climbed onto a nearby pallet of roofing shingles and was surveying its domain with the quiet dignity of a benevolent monarch. "I'm going to recommend a special wildlife cohabitation permit," she said. "It's rare. It's a lot of paperwork. You'll need to meet certain conditions: proper veterinary oversight, no confinement, regular behavioral assessments. But yes, Mr. Henderson, I think this cat belongs here." The cheer that went up from the warehouse crew startled a flock of pigeons off the roof. Hank Morrison was openly weeping into his handlebar mustache. Tommy was doing a victory dance that looked like a man trying to shake a spider off his leg. Even Darlene, steady, unflappable Darlene, was grinning so wide her face looked like it might split in half. Bobby Ray just stood there, blinking hard, watching the golden Arizona sunlight pour through the warehouse doors and illuminate the bobcat on its pallet throne, and felt the stone in his chest dissolve into something warm and bright and full. The paperwork took 2 months. Bobby Ray filled out forms he didn't know existed, attended meetings with wildlife officials who used words like anthropogenic habituation interface and interspecies behavioral protocol, and spent more time on the phone with Margaret Caldwell than he spent with his own wife, a fact his wife, Jolene, found hilarious. "You're adopting a bobcat," Jolene said one evening over dinner, shaking her head. "I'm not adopting it. I'm providing a licensed cohabitation habitat. You bought it a heated bed. It gets cold at night." Jolene patted his hand. "You're a good man, Bobby Ray Henderson." The permit came through on a Thursday in October, and Bobby Ray thumbtacked it to the wall of his office right next to his business license and the photo of his father on opening day. Official Wildlife Cohabitation Permit Number 2. 024-WCP-0347, the first of its kind in the county. And Bandit? Bandit didn't care about permits. Bandit cared about 3 things: hunting, patrolling, and the specific way Hank Morrison scratched the spot behind its left ear. In that order. By the 6-month mark, the rodent problem at Henderson's Lumber was not just solved. It was obliterated. Bandit had become the most efficient pest control system in the history of the building supply industry. The cat hunted at night mostly when the warehouse was quiet and the rats came out to forage. By morning, the evidence of Bandit's nocturnal activities would be neatly arranged near the loading dock. A row of dispatched rodents laid out with what the crew swore was deliberate precision, like a hunter displaying trophies. "It's showing us what it caught," Tommy marveled. "It's filing a report," Darlene corrected. "Employee of the month, every month." They actually made a plaque. Hank hand-carved it from a piece of reclaimed oak. "Bandit, Employee of the Month. Every month. It hung on the wall near the break room, and Bandit sometimes sat beneath it and groomed itself, which the crew interpreted as pride. Word spread, as word does in small towns, and soon Henderson's lumber became something of a local attraction. People didn't just come for 2x4s and drywall screws anymore. They came to see the Bobcat. Parents brought their children to peer through the warehouse doors, hoping for a glimpse of the famous feline. The Prescott Courier ran a front-page feature, "The Cat That Runs the Warehouse." Local news picked it up, then regional news. Then a video Tommy posted on social media of Bandit riding the forklift with Hank, sitting serenely on the seat beside him like a furry co-pilot, went wildly popular and was viewed 6 million times in a week. "We're famous," Tommy said, scrolling through comments on his phone. "The cat is famous," Bobby Ray corrected. "We're just the staff." And that was perhaps the truest thing anyone had ever said about Henderson's lumber and supply. It wasn't all sunshine and salmon treats, of course. There were challenges. There was the time Bandit cornered a delivery driver in the bathroom for 45 minutes because the man had been eating a tuna sandwich, and Bandit wanted to renegotiate the terms of that sandwich's ownership. There was the incident with the health inspector, who had not been briefed on the Bobcat situation, and had to be talked down from a shelf by Darlene while Bandit watched from below with an expression of mild curiosity. And there was the night of the big storm. It came in November, one of those Arizona monsoon remnants that rolled in from the south like a freight train, all lightning and wind and rain that hammered the tin warehouse roof with a sound like 1,000 drummers. Bobby Ray was at home, watching the weather reports with growing anxiety when his phone rang. It was Darlene. "Bandit's gone," she said, and her voice was tight in a way Bobby Ray had never heard before. "The east loading door blew open in the wind. I came in to check on things, and it's just gone." Bobby Ray was in his truck before she finished the sentence. They searched for 3 days. 3 long, terrible, sleepless days. The entire warehouse crew took shifts driving the roads around the property, walking the desert washes, checking under every bush and behind every rock. Tommy printed flyers with Bandit's picture and posted them at every gas station and feed store within 20 miles. Hank called every wildlife rescue, every veterinary clinic, every rancher he knew. Nothing. The warehouse felt wrong without Bandit. It was too quiet, too empty. The aisles that had once felt alive with the constant, comforting presence of the cat now felt hollow, like a house after someone has moved out and taken all the furniture. The crew went about their work in a subdued haze, and nobody said what they were all thinking, that a habituated bobcat alone in the desert during a storm didn't have great odds. On the 3rd night, Bobby Ray sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The storm had passed, and the sky had cleared, and through the window he could see 1,000,000 stars burning in the cold desert night. He thought about a trembling kitten behind a stack of crates. He thought about copper gold eyes looking up at him. He thought about all the mornings he'd arrived to find Bandit sitting on the loading dock like it was waiting for him, and the way the cat would chirp, that funny little rusty hinge sound when he walked through the door. "Come on home, Bandit," he whispered to the empty warehouse. At 2:17 in the morning, Bobby Ray would remember the exact time for the rest of his life. He heard a sound at the east loading door, a scratching, then a thump, then that chirp. That unmistakable, wonderful, ridiculous chirp. He opened the door, and Bandit walked in. The bobcat was wet, muddy, and looked like it had rolled through every thorn bush in Yavapai County. It had a scratch on its nose, a burr tangled in its ear tuft, and what appeared to be a very dead pack rat hanging from its mouth, which it deposited at Bobby Ray's feet with an air of casual triumph before rubbing against his legs and purring like an outboard motor. Bobby Ray Henderson, 63 years old, owner of Henderson's Lumber and Supply, a man who had not cried since the ending of the movie Field of Dreams, sat down on the concrete floor of his warehouse at 2 in the morning and cried like a baby while a muddy bobcat climbed into his lap and purred. Darlene found them like that an hour later when she came in for the early shift. She took one look, said nothing, and went to the break room to make coffee. Some moments, she understood, were sacred. A year has passed since the morning Tommy Sullivan found a starving kitten behind the crates in aisle 7. Henderson's Lumber and Supply has not had a single rodent incident in 8 months. Business has never been better, partly because of the bobcat-related tourism, but mostly because a warehouse without rats tends to keep its inventory in better condition, which makes customers happy. Bandit is a full-grown bobcat now, a magnificent 32-pound specimen of Lynx rufus with a spotted golden coat, tufted ears that swivel like radar dishes, and a bobbed tail that twitches with perpetual purpose. It patrols the warehouse like a shift supervisor, sleeping on pallets, riding the forklift with Hank, accepting head scratches from Darlene, and tolerating Tommy's attempts to teach it to high five, which have thus far been unsuccessful but have provided the crew with endless entertainment. It comes and goes as it pleases, slipping through the loading dock at dusk to hunt in the desert, and returning by morning to nap in the warm patch of sunlight that falls through the east windows around 9:15. It is never chained, never confined. It stays because it wants to. It stays because in whatever way a wild heart can understand such things, this place is home. Dr. Patterson comes by every 3 months for a checkup and always leaves shaking her head in amazement. "I've studied wildlife behavior for 2 decades, she told Bobby Ray on her last visit. "I've never seen anything like this. This animal has found the perfect balance. It's wild, but it's also part of your community. It's chosen its own path." Margaret Caldwell from Fish and Wildlife stops in occasionally too, always with a clipboard and an official expression that melts approximately 4 seconds after Bandit trots over to greet her with a chirp. "Off the record," she told Bobby Ray last time, "this is the best outcome I've ever seen for a habituated wildcat. Don't tell my supervisor I said that." On warm evenings, when the work is done and the sun is setting behind the Bradshaw Mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose, the crew sometimes gathers on the loading dock with cold drinks and watches Bandit perch on the highest pallet stack, silhouetted against the fading light, surveying its territory with those ancient golden eyes. "You know," Tommy said one of those evenings, leaning back in his camp chair, "I think Bandit thinks it's the boss." "Bandit is the boss," Darlene said. "Always has been," Hank agreed. Bobby Ray said nothing. He just sat there in the warm twilight, watching the bobcat watch the sunset, feeling that thing in his chest again. Not the heavy stone of worry, but something else entirely. Something warm. Something full. Something that felt, if he was being honest, a lot like gratitude. Because here's the thing about Bandit, the thing Bobby Ray understood better than anyone. They hadn't saved the bobcat. The bobcat had saved them. It had turned a struggling warehouse with a rodent problem into a local landmark. It had turned a group of co-workers into a family. It had turned a tired old businessman who thought his best days were behind him into a man who woke up every morning excited to go to work, just to see what his most unusual employee had been up to overnight. And if you drive through Prescott, Arizona on a bright morning and stop in at Henderson's Lumber and Supply for a box of nails or a sheet of plywood, you might just see it. a flash of spotted gold moving between the aisles, a pair of tufted ears poking above a stack of 2x4s, or a magnificent wild cat sprawled across a pallet in a patch of warm sunlight, eyes half closed, purring like it owns the place. Which, in every way that matters, it does. And if you listen closely, you might hear Bobby Ray Henderson walking through the front door at 6:15 in the morning the way he's done for 31 years. Call out, "Morning, Bandit," and you might hear in response a small, raspy chirp like a rusty hinge on a very small door that somehow sounds exactly like the word home.